Someone is always talking to your kids. Social media, advertising, teachers, friends, and on and on and on. They're learning from relationships and current issues, and we can't always be there to monitor what's coming in and or what's going out. Does that worry you? Well, it should. We'll talk about that next with Dr. Phil Leineweber on the Clearly Christian podcast.
Welcome to the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. It's time to know more so you can say no more. It's time for the Clearly Christian podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Cy Smith.
I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian, a podcast about what it means to see the world from God's perspective and then the impact this has on training the next generation to live a life consistent with the biblical worldview. Well, thank you for listening, following along. If you've been doing that for a little while, I would encourage you to hit the subscribe button or leave a review. That'll let other listeners know that the show is worth listening to, and that will also certainly help advance the cause of Christian education. So again, thank you for joining me today. Our guest today is Dr. Phil Leineweber. He's an associate pastor at Berean Baptist Church here in Mansfield. He's also the newly elected president of the school board at Mansfield Christian School. And in short time, Phil's emerged as a well-respected leader and a thinker and speaker on the topic of biblical worldview, particularly as it relates to youth. So I'm excited to welcome him back to our show, and I know you're going to enjoy our conversation today. But first, let me go ahead and set up this episode and tell you what we're going to be talking about. Today, I need you to know more about the process by which children mature spiritually and why a community of believers is so crucial for their success. For decades now, Christian schools have relied upon the home and church to kind of come alongside the school's regular activities, such as chapels and Bible classes and things like that, in order to help children mature spiritually. But at present, we can make very few assumptions today about what kids are actually bringing to school. There's no hiding from our culture, and it's certainly knocking on the doors of our churches, homes, and our schools. The government has a clearly laid out plan for academically what they want children to learn at every grade level as they go through the stages of child development in our school. They're called learning standards, and they lay really the foundation for how our public education system works in this country. Well, how much more important is it then that we have spiritual markers, we have spiritual standards for the spiritual maturation of our kids? The stakes are simply too high for us to tack on Christian activities here at school and just assume the home and church are going to take the lead and that's going to be fine. So several years ago, we decided at our school, Mansfield Christian School, that we'll tackle this challenge of spiritual formation in the school setting. So we created what we're calling the Student Discipleship Plan. And it's really a formal documentation of the process by which children mature spiritually from salvation through discipleship, through carefully laid out spiritual markers, as we're calling them. And there's 5. There's respect, wisdom, grace, trust, and perspective. And these were originally designed by an Awana program to help people work with their children, both at home and at school. And so we adopted these markers based on child psychology. We expanded them to make them applicable for the school setting. And let me just describe each one of those real quickly here. Respect. We start with respect at the earliest ages because studies show that children can learn respect even at ages 4 and 5. So we introduce that to our youngest possible children. We focus on the truths that God's all-powerful. He's all-seeing. He's all-knowing. He can do anything. And God, along with those He's placed in authority over us, deserve our respect. And kids can learn that early on. Then we transition into wisdom in those early elementary years, roughly ages 6, 7, and 8, perhaps. And that's the ability to apply God's word to everyday life situations. So they start to read, they start to write, and they can start to memorize God's word. As a matter of fact, and our guest knows this well, we have our first graders memorize 20 verses on the birth of Christ at Christmas. It's our longest standing Christmas tradition. And they do it each and every year. They've been doing it since 1961, and it's a great thing. And they memorize Luke 2, 1 through 20 on the birth of Christ. And they can do that at that age and learn how that applies to everyday real life, because we want those students to see early on in those young years that real life is not fragmented. Biblical truth is not saved for just chapel and Bible class. It impacts everything we do in our lives. We want them, again, to learn that early on. Then we move into grace in those upper elementary years, grades 4, 5, and 6, which would be roughly, ages 10, 11, and 12, because studies show that the worldview is commonly in place by age 13 for most people. And if you don't reach a trial for Christ by 13, the stats plummet to about 4% chance thereafter, which is incredible. So for these reasons, then, we focus on grace at those age levels. Of course, the truth that salvation is by grace alone, completely unearned on our part. But God, certainly rich in his mercy and grace, extends forgiveness through his Son. And in that same way, we've got to do that for others as we forgive others as well. So we really hit grace hard then at those ages. And then turning into the secondary school, grades 7 through 12, we focus on trust in the junior high and perspective in the high school. Trust. We can depend on God. He has a sovereign plan for our life. We can depend on him through our struggles, through the adversities, through the good times and the bad times. And if you remember anything about junior high, you know that that's spot on for that particular age. It's a time of tremendous change. Insecurities can often push junior high students to seek approval from everybody else but God. And that causes nothing but problems, or as any teacher would tell you, that causes nothing but drama, unfortunately, at that age. And then as they move into high school, they understand certainly the world from God's perspective, because they are trying to discern God's calling for their life, the purpose for their lives that he has for them after high school, using those talents and abilities that he's given them. Then they also learn to recognize other people's perspectives as well, and identify false assumptions from religions that don't recognize Jesus is Lord, and then be able to articulate a solid biblical response in those situations. So that is the long and short of it. That's the spiritual formation at Mansfield Christian School, and it's built on relationships in the context of community. Certainly, again, as Sean McDowell said in a previous podcast, relationships are the runway on which truth lands, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we want to prepare them for the truth by gaining their trust. And again, that'll be the topic of what we want to talk about with Dr. Leineweber today. And again, I know you're going to enjoy that conversation. So in closing, in terms of our opening setup, let me make 2 quick chalkboard points. Number 1, someone every day is shaping how your child will see the world. Someone every day is modeling values that will determine how your child will act in the world. And someone every day is either pointing your child to Christ or distorting his image. So Christian schools are intentional and designed to train students to be more fully conformed and united to Christ, so that when they leave these schools, they have a mature relationship with the Savior and are capable of living for his glory. Chalkboard point number 2, the primary reason that this generation, Gen Z as we know them, disconnects from the faith is a failure to equip them with a biblical worldview that helps them understand and navigate today's culture. They just don't have an anchor to help them amid some of the cultural chaos. Well, Christian schools are designed to solve this problem, but we can't do it alone. Our kids need immersed in a community of faith and learning where the efforts of parents and pastors like our guest today will be multiplied and magnified. So now you know more. And when you know more, you can do more. You can not only act differently, but you can think differently, and you can say no more when you must. So with that, let's bring in our guest, Dr. Leineweber. It's great to have you with us today, brother. Appreciate you and your work in this arena. New expert in this arena, we're going to call you as well. So we're excited about what you have to share today. So welcome.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Smith.
All right. Appreciate it. Again, he's the associate pastor at Berean here in Mansfield. 3 very active boys who attend our school. A pleasure to raise godly men in his home, at church, and at school as well. He has his undergrad and master's in biblical and theological studies from Liberty University, and recently completed his doctorate of ministry from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so he's Dr. Phil Lieneweber now. We're excited about that. Enjoys reading, kicking the soccer ball with his boys, and anything outdoors, and I can attest to that. And he's in short time, again, become a leader and a good friend, and we just appreciate you and all you mean to the school and so many families that have chosen to really invest so heavily in not only their kids, but also Christian education. So thanks again for being here.
Yeah, it's an honor. Yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
All right, good. Well, you heard me say we can make very few assumptions about what kids bring to school today. Yeah. And I think maybe that's, that just, maybe I'm stating the obvious, but it wasn't that way. I mean, I'm 55 and it wasn't that way even just one generation ago. And not that we had it all together, but you could definitely make some assumptions more so than we do today. And that's certainly clear. Does that hold true for the church as well? Are you seeing that in your line of work that, hey, you're starting from a clean slate here? Or how does that work in your context?
Yeah, well, we're all on a roller coaster of change, it seems, especially in the Western world and the American culture. And I was meeting with 4 emerging leaders who are Gen Z. They're in their early 20s. They're interning in our local church, trying to invest in that next generation of spiritual leadership. And the change has happened so quickly in our culture that they can see it. They see benchmarks in their own lifetimes in their early 20s. And just the velocity of change, I think, with the media, and in the internet and the information age, it's unparalleled. And so how do we continue to be faithful about the mission, which doesn't change, to make disciples who follow Jesus and glorify God with their lives? How do we do that in the midst of a storm, where the waves are getting higher and the culture is becoming increasingly anti-faith, anti-Christian, and anti-truth? And so I feel really passionate about discipling young people, especially, to navigate these dangerous waters. Yeah.
I would certainly agree. Velocity of change. That's a great phrase, and we're certainly in the middle of that, and no disputing that at all. So, broadly speaking, then, would you say then that we have a discipleship problem within the faith today in our country? How do you see that playing out from your research?
Yeah, for sure. Well, and like what you alluded to, you can't separate discipleship from a biblical worldview. Discipleship is seeing things. It's both being like Jesus and thinking truth. It's knowing the right things. And you can't assume, for years, I'd say generations in our country, many people, without even knowing it, had the building blocks of a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview. And that's what our first topic was about. Remember when I was on the podcast not long ago. And so speaking of discipleship, you can't remove that idea of a biblical worldview. Impact 360 Institute did a study with Barna that said 4% of Generation Z has a biblical worldview. It's just those building blocks that are required. There is a God, there is a heaven, there's a hell, the Bible is true. You can't assume that young people believe these things. That's half. That's well under half of the oldest generation that's alive right now. It's that big of a shift. With that, the Gen Z is described as the first post-Christian, truly post-Christian generation because of that. They don't have just those defining characteristics that you would just assume of a Christendom mentality, a Christian culture that it has, even if they're not followers of Christ, you kind of assume that those things are true. And so when you're seeking to make a disciple of Jesus, you've got to start from ground zero, build that from the ground up, that framework. And what we're seeing now is you even have millennials raising their children, which is my generation, and they have no sense of biblical literacy. They lack a biblical worldview. And now they're trying to raise their kids. And, even well-meaning Christian millennials, they don't know how to form a Christian worldview in the lives of their children. And so those parents need help in that endeavor. And so, Barna has said as well, today's society is especially and insidiously faith repellent. It's not just a neutral territory. It's a toxic territory that kills faith and kills this idea of Christian truth. And so it's not just holding the line. It's trying to help our kids learn to defend against the attack that's coming at them from media, from their friends, from the cell phone in their pocket. So, I think there's no doubt we're in a discipleship crisis, and maybe a lot of those assumptions that we've had for a long time, that we're just God's grace in the midst of a heritage in our country can't be assumed anymore. So we just assume that everyone prays, that everyone goes to church. And those assumptions are removed. And I think we're realizing, man, we did a bad job at really forming a biblical worldview in the next generation. And we need to recapture, I think, that those forgotten ways in that the early church got of discipleship, life on life, in community, a community of faith, pursuing Jesus.
Yeah, great points. And I like how you said too, that framework idea, because maybe that's what I'm talking about as well. That again, we kind of expected that framework to be built at home. And if it wasn't built at home, or the church at least kind of came alongside, and like you said, everybody went to church. So people were building that framework. So you brought that to school. And then you were able to fit in some of those things within that framework, much like, building a house. And then you also had that other good analogy about the foundation. And if there's no foundation there, and, you and I have well read our Ken Ham, when you start with that wrong foundation, then you struggle to build anything on top of that. And so we're seeing kids with no foundation, no framework, well-intentioned, like you said, millennial parents, but they may be even first-generation believers, so they don't have a great framework themselves, finding themselves growing up in a culture, like you said, that's anti-Christian, that's toxic. So a lot of things working against how it's supposed to be done. A lot of things that coming in saying, boy, this is going to be a challenge.
And even something as simple, and we were talking about this with that group of young leaders today, something is what you would think is a basic Christian truth as sin, the reality of our sinfulness and our need of God's grace, like you spoke of, and salvation, being saved from that. There's a lot of people in our cultural context who to say that you're a sinner is a thought crime. It's verbal abuse. You're damaging my self-worth. To say that I have something broken within me. No, my purpose is self-actualization, to be true to myself, to be authentic. And you're telling me myself is something wrong with it. And so even like the basic building blocks, the basic framework or foundation that the gospel needs can't be assumed. And so it's going to take a lot of conversation, especially with those who are far from Jesus, to help rebuild that building block, to convince people before they can even receive the gospel. They need to see there's a need for it.
That's exactly right. That's why that grace marker is so key in the elementary. And that just what you said is just further evidence of that fact, that is going to be a challenge in and of itself to walk a 10, 11, 12-year-old, and maybe earlier, of course, but also that family, like you said, to recognize that need, that, hey, contrary to everything you've heard, you bringing nothing to the table here. You were born into original sin, and you don't deserve the grace that God's extending to you. And to even, like you said, even semantically to understand that language, because our culture has so confused it with, self-esteem and self-respect and all these things that, are just, boy, hey, you can be who you want to be. And matter of fact, you could even decide you don't want to be a girl at age 6 or 7, and you can go ahead and transition to a boy, or vice versa. So, you don't need to answer to, or you need to challenge all these authorities that say this and draw these absolutes. And so you've been hearing this since age 4, 5, 6, and all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, boy, no, these are sinful things, and you're going to need to be, saved by grace, and God's extending this salvation. Yeah, wow, that's a major shift in thinking.
And then hence the need for us really intensively focusing on making disciples who really think and live biblically, where they have a realization that God has spoken. There is a such thing as truth, capital T, truth, about who you are, who he is, and your need for Jesus. And so the solution hasn't changed. As dire as the times might be, the solution is making disciples of Jesus Christ. And the word doesn't return void. But how we go about that, especially in this climate, might need to change a little bit.
Yeah, that was my next question. Obviously, how do we turn this around in this particular climate? What's out there that is going to work? And I know it doesn't come in a can. I know we don't press a button. I know we don't buy it off the shelf, so to speak, because it is complicated. Anytime you have relationships with churches and schools and homes full of sinners, you're going to have issues. So it's not going to be easy, but it probably is not as complicated as we're making it.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. And you kind of introduced, because we had a pre-conversation before this idea of community. I think one of the things the American church in particular maybe has missed is we've thought that we can mass produce disciples through certain, things that we do, whether it be Sunday school or Bible studies or Bible memorization. And really, we need to get back to just the ways of Jesus. And Jesus had 3 years of active ministry. And what did he do? He spent his time with disciples. He spent time doing ministry, practicing, sending them out, bringing them back. He surrounded himself. He did life with them. And so you see in the life of Jesus modeled how to make disciples. It's through relationships, building a community of faith where there's instruction, there's information, but then there's relationship. It's not just the problem is not just the right information. We could have our kids read all the right books, and they could miss the heart of what it means to love and follow Jesus. And so much of the Christian life is not just taught; it's caught in the context of Christian community. I've said in our church context, how we would often say it takes a village to raise a child. With three boys that are very active, they're all over my neighborhood. Like, they are finding friends. I didn't know there were kids in my neighborhood that existed, and they find them, make friends. They're all over the place. And I'm so thankful for other parents that have watchful eyes in my neighborhood. So it rings true for me. It takes a village to raise a child. But in the context of discipleship, it takes a church to make a disciple, and a whole community. And I think, and for the purpose of this podcast, that includes your school community. And we'll get into that. But like, hey, how does every relationship that your child is interacting with, how is that speaking into who they're becoming? Ephesians 4 says the target for discipleship is that someone looks like Jesus, that we be conformed to the image of Christ, the fullness of Christ. And it gives the recipe for that. It's when the whole body is joined again, working with each part individually together for the building up and the growing of the body of Christ. And this is a huge problem, because in our culture, man, individualism is on the rise. People are media saturated. Their community has become their screen, and we're not living in relationship to one another. And so I think the answer is us to create and to be committed to robust Christian community as individuals, families, and neighborhoods as we seek to follow Jesus. And so surrounding ourselves with other Christians. One author said, what's David Kinnaman, who's the president of Barna, he wrote in "You Lost Me." It's a great book I'd recommend. Talks about why we're losing a generation in the church. He says just this one line: disciples are handmade, one relationship at a time. And it's not something that we can just have the right course sequence, give them the right information, have them read the right books. It's life on life in community, just like Jesus did it. And it takes great intentionality, and it doesn't happen quick.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. One relationship at a time. Obviously, the two key words in that phrase, both relationship and time. And what I thought of, especially when you started out and you said, maybe the church thought that we could mass produce disciples. And boy, yeah, as soon as you said that, what triggered in my mind is that's one of the great flaws of school and what education is because we were designed on a factory model, an outdated European factory model hundreds of years ago. And we should have tossed the whole thing out hundreds of years ago, but we didn't, where we move kids along this K-12 process, right? And we move them like they're on an assembly line. Well, here's your second grade knowledge. Now you can go to third grade. Now you can go to fourth grade. And we, as if knowledge just resided in these little buckets. And we said, yep, here's where you can do multiplication tables. And here's where you can do this. And here's where you can do that. And we know and we have known this for literally thousands, that is not how kids learn. They don't compartmentalize knowledge, or at least the best learning is not compartmentalized and sliced up. It's all interwoven because as we started this, it's built on everything else. So this idea of, I got this compartment, I take 2 or 3 months off, and then I somehow connect it to another compartment, take 2 or 3 months off, connect it. It's a bad model. And every professional educator with some advanced degrees knows it. And so for the church to replicate that by calling it Sunday school, which is another problem, right? Because it's school just like the educational process, is a bad thing, right? You just cannot reproduce disciples. And I've talked about that before in that way. It takes relationships, it takes time, it takes all those things that you were talking about there. So yeah, the last thing the church wants to do is emulate the school process in terms of discipleship, because it does not work well. What we're trying to do in Christian schools is break that down and say, okay, we've inherited this structure. How can we work around it? How can we do some things that are different as a private school, really attacking that and saying, if this is truly what matters, relationships with time, because disciples is the ultimate goals. Well, then how can we build that into our DNA instead of just saying, well, that's the way it goes. Yep. See you later, sixth grade. All that learning is out the window.
And hence, and I'm a Christian school advocate, hence the need to really have, when I think of my 3 boys, I want them to be disciples of Jesus. So who do I want them, knowing it's not just information, who do I want them around day in and day out when they're not around my wife and I? I want them around followers of Jesus. And there's no way that a public school, a government school can have any certainty. It doesn't matter how conservative your community is. They cannot guarantee that. And if discipleship is caught, not always taught, I'm glad my kids have Bible class at school. I think that's great, but that's not enough. I want them to be around real Christians who are living like Jesus, and in music class, in math class, and in gym class. And so, as we think about community, and it gets broader than school, that's one facet. We need to think about home. We need to think about church. We need to think about recreational activities. Who are you allowing your children to be around? And so, I know we're going to get into that in a minute, just as we give advice to parents, but there's a lack of intentionality in our parenting, I would say, in the millennial generation. And we will lose all the more another generation of followers of Jesus. The church will continue to lose ground in our culture if we don't begin being proactive about this.
Yeah, exactly. And what you're really talking about is your ability to trust, who it is that is working with your children. Like I said, every day somebody's shaping how they see the world, how they act, this reflecting Christ or not. So you've got to have full trust. How important is trust for even the kids? How important is trust for your boys? How have you found this generation? Like I said, it seems critical for this generation today.
Yeah. Well, my kids are on the younger side. My oldest son is going to 6th grade. So this isn't as developed as much in terms of interacting with them. But, I was student pastor for years. I'm still involved with our next gen ministries. And I'd say, relationship is of the utmost importance with this next generation. They have been oversold so much. The amount of advertisements they're exposed to every day, they are a cynical, skeptical generation. They don't believe it. This is the generation that grew up with fake news. They realize they cannot trust everything they hear and see. And if someone has something that sounds like a sales pitch, they will turn off immediately. And so how do you break down such a cynical generation? It's got to be through relationship and building trust. It's just an ongoing relationship where you're both living it out in your own life and then willing to share it and have patience over time to build that. It's not going to be easy. There's a wall there, but I think relationship is, the way of Jesus is going to be what works with this next generation. There's that old phrase or maxim: people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. If that was true years ago, it is 10 times more true today. They honestly don't. And you could even say something in a way that you don't even mean it, and you've immediately created a barrier of conversation because the language is evolving, right? We're seeing our language, even the use of words or pronouns, is changing constantly. And so learning what makes people tick, learning how they think, and showing that you care for someone before you try to, even help share the truth with them is going to be integral. And so again, Jesus modeled this for us. Jesus was the Word that became flesh. He was Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus came down, he took on human flesh and lived amongst us, and went, suffered as we do, was tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Jesus modeled doing life on life with people. And again, that's the need. If you want to make a disciple, don't take them to a class, take them into your living room in your home and invite them into your life.
Yeah. Excellent. Yep, for sure. I was thinking when you were talking there about all the voices, then their inability because they, or distrust, their natural distrust because they've grown up with fake news and things like that. So I was thinking about other generations' perspective, and it just kind of struck me. I think for the boomers who are, certainly a big group still with us here. I think for them, any voice that was on TV or in the paper or something like that was believable. And you just you saw no reason why they would lie to you. And I think by and large that anything outside of yourself, it was an adult or something like that, they would believe that, your parents, those things. I think for my generation, maybe a slightly more skeptical, you needed to be an expert, but if you showed yourself to be an expert, then, we were all in. Like I said, you wrote a book perhaps, or, you have a special presentation on TV. So somebody told us you were an expert. Well, then we certainly didn't doubt anything you said. But for millennials and Zs especially, none of those things are valid. All of those things are off the table, because now you've got people, experts fighting with experts, and people on, this news station presents this slant, the other news, and they're just blatantly, open with it, right? And just say, well, everybody knows this is the conservative network, this is the liberal network. They're going to say this is true. This is going to say that is truth. So it's hard for me to even imagine growing up in an environment where everything I see outside of maybe my family, who I trust, I'm naturally, like you said, I'm a skeptic of just about everything. It's hard for us to even put ourselves in their shoes, but it's so necessary. And the only way you're going to do that is by getting to know them and forming a relationship.
Yeah, I think of like the one interesting way to kind of visualize that would be in how we shop. And you think of, at one time, it worked to have an infomercial where you had 3 minutes of demonstrating how a product worked on video with someone who's way over happy about this product. And for $29.99, you can get this shipped to you. And people would pick up the phone and call and buy that product.
Yeah.
Try that with millennials or Gen Z. They're going to laugh at the very idea of an ad like that. I think even Gen X would think that's pretty funny, at least at times. Right. What I want to see is I'm going to go on Amazon or whatever the website is, and I want to see how many reviews. I want to see how many people rated this with 5 stars. And what that is word of mouth. I want a friend of mine say, you need to get this. It works because I trust this source. I trust the crowd source, and I trust the person that I know. And so as we think about discipleship and building trust, what matters most is that relational capital that we've built with people, and then say, hey, look what God has done in my life. And I would love to see him do that in yours.
Yeah, true. Boy, and that's a great marketing discussion that we could take, because we even talk about that in word of mouth marketing, here at the school. And I think most businesses do, because the studies show that, right? You want to appeal to younger generations, then you need narrative that they can trust. Absolutely. So when you think about, okay, we've identified, what's important. We've identified the problem, solution, things like that. What are some of the barriers, even in the church community, that are going to be a challenge to creating some of this? I mean, I think churches probably would all agree, and everybody would the headlines wouldn't surprise us, in the slightest, in terms of the need for discipleship. And this could be an answer to really where we're at in cultivating the next generation of Christian leaders. But what are some barriers that church after church after church is probably going to come up against this and is going to have to overcome it? Yeah.
This could be a whole podcast in and of itself, right? Because this is where I live.
Probably. And you're the expert here.
Well, yeah. Why? I'm envious of Christian school administrators, because you get kids, 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. And what the church has done, just in the last generation or two, is they have lowered the bar of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And, your average Christian, your average church would ask about maybe an hour of you a week. Your average Christian in our country would go to church maybe 2 times a month. And you think, and that's because, we want to just meet people where they are. Well, we've lowered the bar of discipleship because people are busy. People have other commitments. We don't want to make people feel guilty by asking too much. We have in our culture a distrust of institutions in general. Just across the board. I mean, whether it be businesses or government, schooling, we don't trust leaders, and so the church, anything that smells of an institution that associates with money or employees, I don't trust it anymore. And then we have individualism, where we're told all day, every day, it's all about me. And so when I go to church, what am I thinking? What am I getting out of this? How is this ministering to me? How did I feel? How did this service make me feel? I don't want to hear something that makes me feel guilty. I'd rather have me hear something that makes me feel happy. Makes me feel inspired. And all of this is affecting, and in those churches that play to the cultural, I'll call it depravity, they grow numerically often. Because, man, who doesn't want to be told that, God loves you just the way you are, and go get them this week and live your dreams? But that's not discipleship. What did Jesus say? If anyone wants to be my disciple, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. That's not preaching in 21st century America. And so a lot of times that's not the message that we lead to. And so, I'd say just in terms of the church in general, that lowered bar has a generational consequence now. Where are the disciples? Where are the parents who can disciple their own children? Parents are opting to take their kids to sports practices and travel leagues over taking them to student ministry or youth group. It's like anything else is more important. I'll skip Sunday church to go and out in the lake on my boat. It's 90 degrees and sunny. Where else should we be? This is a boat Sunday. We'll get to church next week. Or we'll just turn it on online while we watch the football game on our second screen. And so right. There's just a huge compromise in that. And I think that, the church needs to say, this is not okay. The cost to follow Jesus is real. Something that's just a real implication is, we're in the midst of trying to hire some staff, and there is a pastor shortage across the board. Yeah. There's not that next generation of spiritual leadership, just because there hasn't been that commitment to discipleship in the past. And we're fighting an uphill battle in that way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yep, great point. And that's a other podcast topic for sure. And I've talked about on this one before, the crisis in Christian education as well. Where are the next generation of teachers going to come from, period? Yeah. And public schools are seeing that, but certainly Christian schools are seeing it well. But yeah, churches, same thing. I mean, we know there are thousands and thousands of churches in America who are looking for head pastors, associate pastors, youth pastors, worship pastors. I mean, yeah. And once these boomers have, retired, rehired, and retired again in many cases, right? Who's filling these shoes, and who's filling these pulpits or the classrooms or things like that? And boy, we're reaping what we're sowing, just as you said. So boy, that's a great point. Well, you mentioned at the start of that answer that you're envious of Christian schools because we get them for all that time. So then how do we work together? Maybe as Christian educators and churches and things like that, we know it's going to take, you make a great point. Absolutely no way a church is going to get it done 1 to 2 hours a week, right? That flies in the face of relational time. That was nothing like what the disciples experienced with Jesus, right? Well, hey, I'll see you next week. That never happens anywhere in the scriptures as he's walking and talking and working with them. Matter of fact, they were 24/7, the complete opposite for, all those years in a row there. So how do we work together? Any thoughts on, how do we get on the same page?
Yeah, well, I think, I just think Mansfield Christian, what it's been to our family, we don't have family in this region. We moved here to serve in our local church. And as we became exposed to what Mansfield Christian does, it was just a huge blessing in our lives. And what's neat is, in our context, our Christian school is not attached to one church. It's a non-denominational, it's an independent Christian school. And so what it's done for my wife and I, and now our kids, is it's enlarged our perspective of the church in our region. And we're friends with other pastors, families, other Christians who love Jesus and are trying to be intentional about discipleship. We spent Friday and Saturday at 2 different birthday parties with families that don't go to our local church, but our kids are friends with them. And the whole family was there fellowshipping at these birthday parties, prayer beforehand, conversation around the Lord and what God's doing in our unique context. And yeah, we're playing kickball and eating cake and having a good time. But man, if Jesus made disciples everywhere, man, discipleship was happening at that birthday party, and how we loved one another, how we treated one another, the conversations we were having about the Lord. And Mansfield Christian is one of the reasons is the reason that we were able to experience that. So it helps foster that community. So I think continuing to help foster community amongst capital C church, right? Beyond even one local church. The church is bigger than any one local church. And encouraging that. I'd say one of the pressure things that Christian schooling is facing is, hiring staff, right? And you want a competent teacher, an educator, but for it to be distinctly Christian, they must be a follower of Jesus. And, it's going to be easy, increasingly easy, because of the difficulty in finding people to find both of those. And so I think if Christian schools want to continue to partner well in this making of disciples in the next generation, they've got to hire teachers who are themselves followers of Jesus. That should be I think the first priority. It might mean that we're going to hire some people and help train them to be qualified to be a better educator. But if you miss the discipleship piece, you're never going to reproduce real disciples of Jesus. And so those are just some things. I think just strengthening those partnerships, asking churches in your area, if you're a Christian school leader, administrator, hey, how can we help you? What do you need? How can we come alongside your church to really help move the ball forward? I'm excited about the academy that we're starting at Mansfield Christian. That's going to be for training young people to want to go into ministry or be a Christian worker, a missionary, a Christian educator. And, programs like that become pipelines to spiritual leadership in the local church. I think those things are going to be integral in this next generation as we seek to just push back on the darkness that we're seeing in our culture.
Yeah, great point. I think a lot of churches aren't, or they at least they didn't for the last several decades, realize that Christian schools, one of their priorities is to prepare leaders for the local church. And so we're trying already to establish that. And so not supporting Christian schools hurt you in the long run. Not having a conviction from the pulpit and talking about this, or not having any interest in education whatsoever, does not play well decade after decade when you're looking for, the next generation of church leaders and worshipers and things like that. Well, those people are typically, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Like you said, even with the academy program, things like that. It's interesting, and maybe this is changing a little bit, because certainly in Ohio, you have the Ed Choice program now where every child's eligible for a state scholarship or to a private school of their choice. And you're seeing that in state after state after state all over the country now. And so what you're seeing is now an influx of Christian schools all of a sudden popping up all over the country, because parents can suddenly afford for Christian education in states that maybe they didn't have that opportunity before. So churches now are starting to call some of these accrediting agencies and saying, hey, we'd like to start a Christian school. So now churches are seeing that, this could really play to our advantage. Well, yeah, we've been saying this for 60 years, that, hey, get on the same page here and get connected to your local Christian school, because that's going to help the health of your church as well. Maybe we'll make a turn there. But we'll see. And maybe times have changed thanks to the school choice movement and things like that we've been able to put in place. Well, if a parent's out there and they've heard everything we've said today, it's been a great discussion, and they say, you know what, I know my child has not received the time that he or she needs to be discipled well. And my husband and I work, or my wife and I work, and we're limited time. Maybe we're young believers, maybe not, but we are very distracted. We're busy. Maybe they're just feeling, for whatever reason, could be good things, could be not so good things. Maybe you got to work 2 jobs, right? We don't want to be overly critical of people, but they say, yeah, I resonate with what, Phil and Si are saying there. And my child needs more time in a discipleship community in a context of believers. Maybe they have a Christian school like MCS in their backyard, and that's the obvious answer. Hey, you may want to give Christian education a look because you're not going to increase necessarily your time at church, right? I mean, it's only open so many hours. Even if you come the maximum hours, you might be there, 3, 4, if you're doing Sunday school, church, and one night, during the week or something like that. That's some of your best families, which, it needs even more than that. But what advice should we tell those people? What do they do? Where do they get started?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, for you to look to Scripture, if a parent's listening, God has ordained you to be the primary leader and discipler in your child's life. And so this is your responsibility. This is your calling. If you have children, if God's blessed you with children, biological or not, it is your responsibility to make them a disciple of Jesus. And the first thing you must do is you must be a disciple of Jesus yourself. If you don't have a desire to open up God's word and read it, if you're not interested in going to church and being engaged in the discipleship programs your church has, I would guess your children won't be either. and they'll be a lot more concerned about whatever you're concerned about or other things. And so you need to model it in the home. And I, as much as I value both our church and the school, my wife and I take that seriously. We're not paying Mansfield Christian, to disciple our children. We're not expecting our church, Berean Baptist Church, to do that. Phil and Sarah are the ones who are going to make disciples of Andrew, Asher, and Jackson. That is our calling in life. And so I'd say take that seriously. And, in the context of this conversation where discipleship requires relationship, there's no more relationship that should be integral in the life of your child than the parental child relationship. And maybe for some parents, you need to do some rebuilding there. Maybe you've allowed the child to latch onto other voices or a screen, and they're getting more information and discipleship from a screen or from a toxic relationship than from you. Maybe you need to do some repairing there. One thing I think that could be helpful is to do a relationship audit. Think of the lives of your children. Think who they're relating to and what are those voices that are listening to. Who has capital, that trust in the life of your children? And ask yourself, is this helping them become a disciple of Jesus Christ? Or is it hindering them from that? That might lead you to make some radical decisions about who you do life with, the community that you're a part of, the school that you choose. How are those relationships affecting those children? You should be involved. And when you think of media, especially, who are your kids texting? Who are they friends with on social media? What social media accounts or YouTube accounts are they following and watching? This is the discipleship of the 21st century. And when you see concerns there, shut it down. You wouldn't let a stranger walk into your house and indoctrinate your kids with some strange beliefs, but they're getting it every day from their screen. So take ownership of that and be the primary voice of discipleship. That you had a guest on your podcast a few months ago, Dr. Josh Mulvihill. He talked about parenting with the end in mind. That was a huge blessing to me. And I'd commend that to the audience. Like, go and listen to that podcast. He just talks about intentionality. I sat down that week after listening to that podcast and I started writing that list. I was like, what do I want to see formed in my kids by the grace of God and by his strength? Yeah. What do I want to pray over my kids? So, Proverbs 13:20 says, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer. Who are your kids around? And are they becoming more like Jesus and growing in wisdom because of it? So we could go on, but I think that's enough to start with.
Yeah, that's great. No, and I appreciate that reference to that other podcast. I was thinking that same thing as well, that was good. Yep. In order to get there, I've got to take those steps along the way and have some conviction. Yeah, I was writing that down as well. Have some ownership. What you said, you're going to have to step up and be the parent that you've been called to be. And your kids will respect you for it. They will love you for it. And it's not like you're doing something bad. We're making it sound like, come on, you could have this negative tone. No, you're doing exactly what God wants you to do. But it is called a spiritual discipline for a reason, right? Because you need to be disciplined in your devotional life and your prayer life and all those things that you said. Because it's not gonna come naturally. Your human nature is just gonna want to, take it easy and expect hey, I can put in as little as possible and get maximum results. Well, as an adult that nothing in life works like that. I don't come to work and put in the minimal effort and just continue to get raises and promotions. That's not real life. Talk to any athlete. They don't just show up and all of a sudden you're an all-star, right? They put in discipline, then they achieve success. So again, we know it, but we've got to be challenged maybe to walk it out. So great words. Well, in conclusion then, hey, if they want to know more about maybe this topic or know more about, your ministry, Berean, how can they contact you, or what are you recommending besides Josh Mulvihill's book? That was a good plug there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, our church is BereanFamily.com. We're a conservative evangelical church here in Central Ohio. If you're in this area and you're looking for a local church that's serious about making disciples, we'd love for you to join us in that endeavor. You could follow me at philwithgrace.com, Phil, like my first name, Phil. And would love to connect with you. You can reach out to me there if you have any questions, or would love to connect. And I'm thankful to be part of a community here in Mansfield, Ohio, of both school, church, and home, our friends who are just seeking to follow Jesus and take it seriously.
Yeah, and I appreciate you. Yep, and I'd encourage you to get in touch with Dr. Leineweber, communicate with him. He's a wealth of information. Again, congratulations to you on finishing your doctorate. I think it's well-deserved, certainly well-earned, and super happy for you. And I know it's going to continue to boost the trajectory of your professional work as well. So certainly happy for you. So thank you again, brother, for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks. Always welcome.
Excellent. Excellent. And thank you again for joining me today on the Clearly Christian podcast. I trust that now you know more about the spiritual formation process of our children and why a community of believers is so crucial for their success. Again, if you like the show, help us spread the word and leave a review, hit the subscribe button or the like button, and let others know, again, the show is worth listening to because we want to advance the cause of Christian education here nationwide and even around the world. Remember, the only way we're going to turn things around in this country, in your home and church and otherwise, is to increase the number of people who live and operate every day with a biblical worldview. And the greatest hope to achieve that mission is indeed Christian education, either in the home or at a Christian school. So this is Dr. Cy Smith with the Clearly Christian podcast. Thank you again.
Thank you for listening to the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. Hear more episodes at clearlychristianeducation.com. If you'd like more information about Christian education in your neighborhood, or if you're interested in education opportunities at Mansfield Christian School, or if you agree with Dr. Smith and want to help him in his mission to influence and awaken Christian America, you can send Dr. Smith an email through the clearlychristianeducation.com website. Message him on the Clearly Christian LinkedIn or Facebook page, or call the Clearly Christian Connection line at 419-756-5651. This has been the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith on clearlychristianeducation.com, brought to you in conjunction with Mansfield Christian School, a Berean Media production.